In America, right? Like we're big on the superheroes, right? But that's not the case in pretty much everywhere else. So you're not big on capes. So I was actually very curious, what kind of comics did you grow up on?
Well, I've been thinking about this a bit recently myself, just because, with 30 years, haven't hit the 30-year mark this year.
In your career?
Yeah. And I figured out that the reason is, when I was a kid, where I grew up, small town outside Belfast, the distribution of comics wasn't really as extensive as it might have been in Belfast itself.
Right.
So whereas my longtime collaborator John McCrae, living in Belfast, is able to amass a pretty decent collection of American comics or their British reprints, I never saw them. All I saw were the British newsstand titles. The American comics that I did see were few and far between, and I just didn't see enough of them to develop much of an interest. People might have heard of 2000 AD, most obviously Judge Dredd.
Oh, yeah.
That's the comic I grew up on, but I also read a great deal of war material. There was a weekly anthology like 2000 AD called Battle, and it followed the same format, 6 or 7 4-page stories, black and white artwork, weekly. There were things called the picture libraries, War Picture Library, Battle Picture Library, just one-shot, one-off stories, 4 of them published a month. And you could find these on any British newsstand.
Right, yeah, so they're readily available.
They were the ones I found. So were it not for this quirk of fate, I'd be like anybody else. I'd have the same interest in American comics and superhero comics that everyone else does, because it's kind of like religion. If you get it that young, you're never going to get rid of it. Once the hook's in, you can't really. I would contend you can't really come to material like that as an adult and develop that same affection for it that you would as a kid. But that's why I ended up liking what I like and writing what I write.
Okay, cool.
Yeah.
How did you break in?
I was reading a comic called Crisis, and Crisis was a short-lived kind of sister publication to 2000 AD, and it was a political comic. And their signing tour came to Belfast in actually October of '88, and I got talking to the editor, Steve McManus, and I asked him, political comic, would you be interested in a story about the Northern Ireland Troubles by someone who lives in Northern Ireland? And he said that's exactly what we'd be looking for. So I sent off some ideas, didn't think any more of it, and then the following January, on my birthday, my 19th birthday, I thought, why not, eh? And I called them up and mentioned the story, and I was expecting, we'll get back to you. But in fact, the guy said, oh yeah, we wanted to talk to you about that. And that was it.
Okay, nice.
Off to the races.
Those characters in Crisis, those are the same characters that popped up in Dix like years later, right?
Yeah, the 2 characters in Dix were sort of supporting characters in the first story, Troubled Souls, which is a much more straight-laced, heavily political story. Dix grew out of a desire, I think, to show that I had more than one string to my bow, that I wasn't just the serious, sincere political writer, but that I could do other kinds of material as well. Dix went about as far in that direction as was humanly possible, I would say.
There were religious aspects to Crisis when you were writing Crisis.
Yes.
Like, did you get any flack even then? Because I know, of course, we know about Preacher and something that pushed back about that, but did you get flack back then for that?
Yeah, there was a story I did, the follow-up to Troubled Souls was called True Faith, and it's a sort of religious black comedy about a madman who starts burning down churches to try and provoke a confrontation with God. It turns out God isn't interested. But that, when it was collected as a trade paperback, the guy doing publicity for the company sent copies of the book to every major religious organization and church in the country, and it was withdrawn from sale by the publisher within a couple of weeks. So yeah, that's one promotional tactic that I don't think was tried again.
Okay, so there's, like, not for everything, but there's a theme like with religion in a lot of your books. Is that because of your upbringing? Like, where's that fascination with that particular type of story come from?
I think it's I think my sort of general disdain for organized religion comes from growing up in a place, in a province, where people are fighting a religious war, which if you're an atheist, makes no sense at all, because it's people fighting over how they worship their imaginary friend, and they're killing each other over this. You know, this is ultimately miserable business. Now, I was not directly involved in the Troubles. I grew up kind of on the edge of it. But when you see that going on, when you hear the latest grim news of murder or brutality on the radio every morning, and you think, my God, there's no end to this, and they're doing it. They're doing it for the most spurious of reasons, and yet they will not stop. And I think it's that more than anything else that gave me my distrust of religion. I wasn't exactly raised atheist, because, I mean, you don't really raise someone an atheist. You just do nothing.
Defeats the purpose.
Right. So, you know, to me, when I first encountered religion, it was a strange thing when the teacher suddenly told us that there was a God who could see everything we did, who could see into our hearts, who was inside us and with us always, and would ultimately reward us or punish us for our deeds. I was absolutely bewildered by that. I thought that was incredibly strange, but I can remember being 6 and looking around the class at the other kids, and they were all just nodding. Yeah, makes sense, because of course they'd already been told this at home. So to them it made perfect sense. Wow. I was somewhat bewildered.
Right. Yeah. I mean, and like it's giving you like fuel ever since then for creative endeavors.
Yeah, I think I even got a bit into Preacher, where young Jesse Custer is introduced to the notion of God for the first time. And I think he says it's his horrible grandmother telling him it, and I think he says something like, it sounds kind of scary, and he's promptly slapped around the head for it. Now, I never had anything like that happen. What happened to me was, in the schoolyard after we'd been told about this, I can remember people saying, do you love God? I love God. I certainly love God. Do you love God? And I was the only one who went, no. I think I hate him, meaning I'm terrified. Yeah. You know? Right. And then I went home and asked my mother about it, and she said, well, what do you think? And I said, well, it sounds kind of stupid, meaning I'm terrified. And she said, well, there you are then. Yeah, okay. And that was it.
She was just so totally okay with that.
Yeah.
Okay, that's cool. Yeah. You transitioned to 2000 AD, of course, right? Like, were you a big Judge Dredd fan growing up?
Oh, huge.
Oh, yeah?
Huge. I mean, for me, that is actually a bit of a misstep. It turns out that I'm not very good at writing Judge Dredd. I mean, I was very grateful for the opportunity at the time, but I think I was too much of a fan and too in awe of what had come before. Okay. And I just didn't have that perspective that allows you to step back and really examine the thing and find your own way into the character. Right. I could not do that with Dredd, and I did a couple of years worth of Dredd stories and really didn't do very good work. But I mean, at the time, of course, because that's with hindsight, at the time I was delighted to be writing this character that I'd read as a kid.
Right, yeah. Was it intimidating? Because you came in after John Wagner.
Yeah,
and I mean, John Wagner's been doing it forever, really. But
that's right.
At the same time, was that a little intimidating?
I don't recall being intimidated. I recall more of a sense of just diving in with both feet and loving what I was doing, you know, but again, without the perspective to judge what I'm doing. Now, contrast that, on the other hand, with my work on The Punisher, where I never read The Punisher as a kid. Right. But while I might not be interested in the minutiae of his previous adventures, there is enough about the character that puts me in mind of characters I've enjoyed in comics, on TV, and in film, that I'm able to find my way into the character. I'm able to find my way into writing Frank Castle.
Right, yeah.
I just didn't have that with Dredd.
Right. But I mean, it kind of provides a fresh perspective too, I imagine. Like, and I think that's what people have responded to with your run on Punisher.
Yeah. I mean, I've often joked that I think Frank is a British comic book character born on the wrong side of the Atlantic by mistake, because he is so unlike the other Marvel or DC mainstream characters. Yeah. One, he kills people. Two, he's just an ordinary guy. You know, he has no superpowers. Whereas, on the other hand, a character like Frank Castle would have fit into some of the comics I read as a kid, like 2000 AD, or a similar title called Action. Someone like Frank would have fit into those comics quite well. Very much inspired by the this sort of early 70s vigilante cop notion that you see in things like Dirty Harry. Exactly. And the British comics of the era were much more heavily influenced by film and TV than they were other comics.
Right, yeah. Right, that makes sense. So how did you transition into U.S. comics?
The first story that I did, Troubled Souls, was collected as a 100-page trade paperback. And that, with full-color artwork by John McCrae, was a very nice portfolio of my work. And it was great. It was a great thing to give to American publishers. And it was both Karen Berger and Archie Goodwin read it separately, and both commissioned me to do work. In Karen's case, of course, that was Hellblazer, because Jamie Delano was coming to the end of his run, and they needed someone to step in.
And is that how you first encountered Steve Dillon? Like, had you known each other prior, or?
No, I met Steve in the summer of '89, but I didn't really hit it off with him until he moved to Dublin a few months later. And I was still in Belfast at the time, and the following summer, myself and a couple of other people came down, and we had a weekend on the beer with Steve, and he and I sat up very late one night. Actually, it was well into the following morning, and I can remember we killed off a bottle of whiskey, and we just talked about what we thought comics were for, what you could do with comics, what the form was capable of. And there was an almost audible click. I can remember that. That was one of those things where it's like, yes, you're the one.
Yeah.
And we did some work together, a couple of Judge Dreads, and he did a couple of fill-ins on Hellblazer. But it wasn't until he came on as regular artist on the book, about halfway through my run, that we really sort of meshed, and everything else followed from that.
Now, you mentioned John McCrae earlier. I actually didn't want to skip over that. Like, did editorial introduce you to him? Did you know him prior, or?
I knew John because he and a friend had opened Belfast's first comic shop in 1987. And so I would go there to get my comics, and I got talking to him there. And then when Troubled Souls was accepted, it was obvious that a Northern Ireland-based comic artist was going to have a massive advantage over anybody else. This was pre-internet, so sending people a ton of reference material just wasn't as easy as it had been. And at that point, John, I think, had already gotten work. He'd gotten a couple of short stories for Marvel UK. And the only other guy was Will Simpson, and he was up to his neck in Judge Dredd and other work for 2000 AD, so that basically meant it was John. I mean, I'm aware that now there is quite a big Irish comic scene, but in those days there really was not. And, you know, you could count the number of people working in comics on the fingers of one hand.
All right. Let's talk a little bit about Preacher. You definitely brought that up. First of all, where did that concept come from? Because, I mean, already it's like, for me, I got to be honest with you. Like, I came into comics because of superheroes. Left comics because of superheroes.
Right.
And then I just happened to stumble upon Preacher and The Authority at the same time. And it was kind of like, I didn't even know comics could do this.
Right.
You know what I mean? And so, like, for me, it was sort of like a lightning rod. It was just sort of like, oh, comics can do anything.
Right. Which has been the line I've been selling all along.
Yeah.
Really, comics can do anything.
They can do anything.
Yeah.
And so, I'm just very curious, like, where did the concept for Preacher come from?
Well, it came in stages. DC had told us, because they were so pleased with how our Hellblazer work had done, that whatever Steve and I came up with next, they would take.
Okay.
And so I suppose towards the end of the Hellblazer run, I'm thinking about what that new project's going to be. And as I said, it came in stages, almost in fits and starts. I put it together instinctively. I wanted it to be an American story. I wanted it to have qualities of a Western. I wanted there to be horror in it, a lot of supernatural material. Let's get religion in there. I wanted an arch villain of such appalling, horrific evil that he would be unforgettable. I also wanted a proper Old West gunfighter as a walking embodiment of that time. I thought an Irish vampire would be good.
Okay.
And I wanted the lead female character to be really a girl in a black cocktail dress with a giant pistol. And the lead guy, the notion of him being a preacher and the thing being called preacher, that came along a bit later on. So did the search for God, because I've got all these elements.
Yeah.
But what I don't have is the thread running through it that's going to bind it all together. You know,
Right.
what does the preacher do? Well, he searches for God.
Yeah.
So let's make that literal.
Right.
And then the first couple of years, I really was just proceeding on the instinct. It was like, well, this seems to work. Shall we do a bit more? What'll we do next? Shall we put the little boy in the coffin? Let's put him in the coffin. That seems to work. I was about 2 years into it before I figured out where it was going and how it was going to end. Yeah.
Okay. Like, was the when you made that transition? Oh, well, first of all, were you at all cushioned by like some of the, you know, the outrage, I guess, that was surrounding the book? Like, did it kind of like keep you away from it so you could just write your own thing? Like, did some of that infiltrate like your?
I did hear about it. You
Yeah.
know, again, this is. I was going to say it's pre-internet. It was right at the beginning of the
Yeah, it
internet
was, right.
in its current form. You
Yeah.
know. But I got the letters of complaint and praise.
Yeah.
I saw why people liked it, why they didn't like it. I will say that for any notion of Preacher being a controversial book, there was never really a massive shitstorm over it. It was more a case of a few individuals continuing to complain long past the point when everyone else had lost interest. The
Right.
sense I got really was, instead of there being a constant controversy, it was more a case of people looking at the book, deciding if they were going to read it or not, and if it wasn't for them, simply leaving it and moving
Right,
on,
yeah,
which
yeah.
I prefer,
Right.
actually.
Right.
Yeah.
No, that's funny. I mean, it's like, because I think people forget that now with like social media, right? Like,
Right.
People don't realize it's like usually like a handful of people that are raising hell,
Right.
you know, and
Right.
everybody else is perfectly fine moving on, or
Yes.
just, hey, this is my cup of tea, I'll run with it.
Exactly. There is still that ability to say, this is not for me. However,
Right.
if you like it,
Yeah.
please continue.
Right. And I
Yeah.
think that's key. Like,
Yeah.
not everything's going to be for everybody.
Yeah,
Right,
but
so-
something enraged someone to the point that they kicked up a fuss, that it became an issue, that the next thing I knew, we were out the door.